Hey everyone, welcome back to Wicked Deeds. We're your hosts. I'm Brittany.
And I'm John.
And today we'll be covering our first listener suggestion. A big thank you to Lorraine for reaching out and letting us know about this story. We love hearing from all of you. And if there's a case you'd like us to research, please don't hesitate to get in touch. And while you're at it, if you enjoy our content and want to help us continue doing what we're doing, please take a minute to leave us a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify. They mean a lot more than you may think. Now, with that being said, no frills with this one. Let's just dive right in. Today's case is about the murder of David Cox.
You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth!
Do those words sound familiar to you? Even if you've never seen the iconic exchange between Tom Cruise and Jack Nicholson, you've likely heard of, or heck, even used the catchphrase, "You can't handle the truth," one time or another. But did you know that the film A Few Good Men, where that famous line comes from, was inspired by true events? That there was an infamous Code Red incident which actually took place? Okay, maybe you do. But have you ever heard the name David Cox, or do you know anything about him? Did you know that he was involved in the real Code Red incident, and that he was murdered less than 5 years after receiving an honorable discharge from the Marines? And did you know that his case is still unsolved? While A Few Good Men went on to be seen in thousands of theaters worldwide, gross hundreds of millions of dollars, and still has people quoting it decades after its release, David Cox never became a household name. The adaptation of his lived experiences seemed to have overshadowed his actual life and the tragedy which befell he and his family. David's murder and the investigation that followed may not be as enthralling to some as a star-studded blockbuster, but they're real, as is the pain still felt by the people he left behind. David Cox was born in Boston, Massachusetts on November 27, 1966, to his parents, June and Arthur. He was one of 3 children, having a sister, Christine, and a brother, Stephen. Later in life, he moved to Needham, Mass., which was only about a 30-minute drive from the state's capital. David went on to attend Needham High School, where his dreams of joining the Marine Corps flourished. It's reported in an article with the Baltimore Sun that David and a friend of his from school, Jay Steves, quote, made a pact enlisting in the U.S. Marine Corps under the buddy system that guaranteed they could go through basic training together on Parris Island, end quote. After the two graduated in 1985, David and Jay hurried off to their local recruiter. They couldn't wait to get started. By the time 1986 rolled around, David was stationed in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, also known as Gitmo, and things were going great. He earned himself numerous accolades, most notably that of a Good Conduct Award, along with multiple letters of commendation for his service. That same Baltimore Sun article referenced earlier stated that David was assigned to the, quote, Rifle Security Company, Windward Side, 2nd Platoon, a group of 30 men who lived by a fierce code of honor, end quote. However, that code of honor would be called into question when David was thrown into a whirlwind of trouble in July of 1986, when he was involved in a hazing incident, which has been referred to as a Code Red. I'll give you a rundown of the whole scenario. So, there was a fellow Marine named William Alvarado who'd written to his state senator, bypassing his chain of command within the military. In the letter, he criticized the conditions he was subjected to, alleging they were substandard, and made claims that some of his fellow Marines had taken part in actions which could be deemed criminal. I've seen it rumored that those supposed actions could have had something to do with rounds being fired into the Cuban territory, but I haven't been able to nail that down for sure. Regardless, Alvarado's letter had essentially classified him as a whistleblower, revealing potential happenings at Gitmo that may very well have been unacceptable behavior. Unfortunately for him, word of that letter made its rounds, and because of this, those around Alvarado held him in contempt. He was branded by his fellow Marines as a, quote, malingerer, which is defined as a person who, quote, pretends or exaggerates incapacity or illness as to avoid duty or work, end quote. As the malice towards Alvarado grew, a group of Marines who've been referred to as the 10 snatched the alleged shirker from his bed in the middle of the night to perform the code red. David Cox was among them. Alvarado was bound and dragged to the bathroom, his eyes masked with a wad of cloth shoved in his mouth to keep him quiet. Once inside their desired location, the 10 got to work. They took a pair of clippers to Alvarado, shaving his head as he struggled to free himself. As the hazing ritual continued, David realized something was wrong. Alvarado had stopped fighting. David notified his cohorts of his observation and made them stop what they were doing immediately. The target of their persecution was no longer breathing. With a sense of worry taking over the room, the Marines rushed to find aid for Alvarado. Now, if you've seen A Few Good Men, you probably remember that the victim of the Code Red ended up dying. But that's not the true story. Luckily, Alvarado survived and went on to make a full recovery. As you can imagine, a situation like this couldn't go unpunished. All 10 Marines involved in the hazing were charged with various crimes, the worst of which was attempted murder. With the plea bargain on the table for those involved, they could accept it and escape criminal charges, but would receive a dishonorable discharge from the Marine Corps. David felt as though the actions he'd taken the night of the Code Red were a result of orders insinuated by his commanding officer. He refused to take the plea deal and, instead, decided to take his chances in a court-martial, knowing that murder was never his intent. So, David worked with a lawyer, Don Marcari, and planned to fight this battle. With the claims of implied orders being denied by the ones said to be responsible, Marcari was frank with his client and told David that this would be an incredibly difficult case to win, maybe even impossible. In an article in the Baltimore Sun, there's a passage describing some of Marcari's exchange with David. It stated, quote, Mr. Marcari recalled, David told me, I have nothing else. All I want to be is a Marine. I said, David, you could take this deal and go home. And he said again, no, I want to be a Marine, end quote. David couldn't give up. This was his life, all he ever wanted to do. So he fought back. His trial began in 1987 and lasted only 4 days. David came out nearly unscathed, being found guilty of only a misdemeanor charge of simple assault, which carried a 30-day sentence. During the days leading up to the court-martial, he'd already spent over 30 days in military jail and was released with time served. It's reported that several of the 10 hadn't been so fortunate, though, and based on their decisions, were dishonorably discharged. After the trial, from 1987 to 1989, David Cox continued his career in the Marines, and it seemed like things were on the up and up. In late summer of 1989, he received an honorable discharge and moved back home to Boston that same year. He found work doing a variety of jobs and met a woman named Elaine whom he built a relationship with. A few years after David had started to get his life on track outside of the Marines, A Few Good Men hit the theaters in 1992, and David was furious. He couldn't believe that Hollywood had capitalized on his life, making millions off a story that wouldn't have existed without him. In an article with the Baltimore Sun, David's brother Stephen stated, quote, mostly he didn't like the outcome, that the 2 Marines were relieved of duty and dishonorably discharged. The whole thing ended up rotten in the end, end quote. It's understandable that David would feel slighted, having lived through the true events, knowing the real outcome, only to have it twisted for entertainment.
I can see why you'd be pissed off. Imagine going through something like that, coming out on the other side, and while moving on with your life, you find out that someone sold your story to the highest bidder without your consent. And not only that, but they change parts of what happened, which end up making you look bad.
I wonder if they made those changes to avoid having to get consent from anyone that was actually involved. I don't know how movie rights work from a legal standpoint, but think about the Anna Delvey story. She sold it for like $300,000 to Netflix.
Right? I bet if the producers of A Few Good Men approached the guys who were involved in the real Code Red and offered them cash or insight into the making of the movie, they probably could have made something that still performed well at the box office while not snubbing the people responsible for their material.
Exactly. And I bet that's where most of David's resentment came from. His frustration with the film was obvious as he made appearances on local radio talk shows, did interviews, and was openly vocal about his distaste for the production company, and it seemed as though several of the other Marines involved in the Code Red felt the same way. From what I understand, members of the 10 were working on a lawsuit that was going to be filed, and David was contemplating getting involved as a complainant. However, before David could do so, he disappeared. January 4th, 1994 was the first snowstorm in the Boston area that year. Over 8 inches of snow covered the ground overnight. Stephen, David's brother, had asked him to go out for drinks that night and watch a basketball game at a local bar. David was surprised by the invitation due to the poor weather and was hesitant at first, but ultimately obliged. Stephen went on to pick him up and they drove together to Houlihan's bar, located on Route 9 in Framingham. It's been reported that David seemed out of sorts that night, and Stephen was slightly concerned about him. David had recently moved in with his girlfriend, Elaine, and Stephen said that it appeared as though the two may have been having issues. It's unclear if things weren't going well because of the new living arrangements or if it was something else that was eating at him. But either way, it doesn't seem as though Stephen pried too much, and the two hung out at the bar until about 10:30. Stephen dropped his brother off at his home a short time later. It's stated in the Unsolved Mysteries episode on David's case that once he arrived back home, he decided he was going to sleep on the couch due to a back issue he was experiencing. The next morning, on January 5th, Elaine got ready for work and said goodbye to David as she headed out the door around 8:30 a.m. Now, January 5th, 1994 was an important day for David. His employer, UPS, for whom he'd been working part-time for, was going to be calling him in regards to an upgrade to a full-time position. This call came around 11:30 that morning, with the representative from UPS telling David, "Congratulations, you're hired full-time." But David never answered, and a message was left on his machine. When Elaine called David later that morning and couldn't get in touch with him, she decided to check their messages and heard the one from UPS. I'm sure she was ecstatic for him and wanted to talk to him about the good news. She waited a little while and tried calling again around early afternoon. The message was still there, and David still wasn't answering. Once 5:30 p.m. rolled around and Elaine arrived home, she was instantly filled with dread. She told the producers of Unsolved Mysteries that all the doors in their house had been left open, and their shared pet, a rabbit named Lenny, was roaming free around the house. This stood out because they always kept the rabbit gated off in the kitchen. It's soon discovered that David's truck, which you'd assume he would take with him if he'd planned to leave the house, was still in the driveway. And strangely, the keys were still in the ignition. Not only that, but David's 9mm handgun was left in the glove box, with one of his paychecks sitting on the dash, which hadn't been cashed yet.
This immediately makes me think that something may have happened to him while he was trying to leave the house or as he was getting into his vehicle. Unless he regularly left uncashed checks and his firearm in the unlocked car with his keys in the ignition, I can't imagine anyone thinking otherwise.
Well, my initial thought was maybe he went out to start the car to heat it up. It was January in Massachusetts, so it was cold and it had just snowed the night before. And then, while he was in the house grabbing whatever else he needed, maybe he was ambushed? The only thing I don't know is if the car was actually still on. I've only ever seen it reported as the keys being in the ignition. But for all we know, the car had been running for hours and ran out of gas by the time Elaine got home. Either way, with the odd circumstances surrounding the house and car and David nowhere to be found, Elaine reported him missing later that night. Based on my research, it doesn't seem like a lot was done in terms of the investigation in the early days. I can't tell how serious authorities were when it came to searching for him, as I've only been able to find a handful of articles from when David first went missing. It seems as though the Cox family was looking for him and even consulted psychics to attempt to garner information about where he might have been. Several months would go by before the headlines blew up with new developments in David's case. 3 months later, on April 2nd, 1994, David's body was found. It's reported that a canoeist who was traveling along the Charles River located in Medfield, Massachusetts, had spotted something in the woods off the side of the waterway that looked like a shoe. After moving some brush and tree limbs out of the way, the man discovered that what he'd seen was a white sneaker belonging to a deceased male, later identified as David Cox. Authorities were contacted immediately and responded to the scene which was located only 5 miles or a 10-minute drive from David's home.
How the hell did this guy canoeing down the Charles River spot a random shoe in the woods? Based on the pictures in Bob Ward's article that were taken from the scene, he must have had friggin' eagle eyes.
Yeah, and to think, he got out of the river to take a closer look at it. Honestly, just looking at these photos up close on a computer, I can't even tell there's anything under the brush, never mind being however many feet away, bobbing along a river. But anyway, once authorities were on scene, one of the things that stood out to them was how far into the woods David's body had been. If you were walking in from a roadway or parking lot, it would have taken you around 30 minutes to get to his location. At first, the articles written on his case didn't elaborate on whether or not David had been placed there after he'd been killed, or if he'd been murdered at the same spot where he was found.
If it was a 30-minute walk into the woods to get to the crime scene, I'd be hard-pressed to believe that someone carried him that far.
Well, once the investigation had progressed a bit further, it was confirmed that the location in the woods was the spot where David had been killed. It appears as though he was walked out to this place in the woods specifically. It was also reported that David had died from several gunshot wounds, 3 shots to his left torso and 1 to the base of his neck, seemingly execution style. In an article from Boston 25 News, Lieutenant Kevin Shea stated, quote, "It looks like David was shot and died right there. I say that because of the position of his body and evidence found at the scene," end quote. From what I can tell based on reports by major publications, it seems as though there were 9mm shell casings found at the scene, which most likely helped investigators come to that determination. Once David had been found, newspapers were full of headlines like, quote, "Ex-Marine who felt a few good men maligned him is mysteriously murdered." It was hot news, a crazy story, and it was getting people's attention. Not only because of its connection to the blockbuster film, but also because the circumstances surrounding David Cox's murder were already so bizarre. Why were all the doors in his house left open? Why was his truck left in the driveway with the keys in the ignition? Who would he have willingly walked into the woods with? David was a well-trained Marine who could likely handle his own. But what stood out the most was the fact that this particular location appeared to be scouted out specifically. It was the perfect place to shoot and kill someone, because it sat smack dab between 2 gun ranges. No one would have thought twice about shots ringing out in the area. It was a common occurrence. Based on what's been reported, it seems as though authorities immediately believed this to be a premeditated attack on David, that he was lured into the car of the individual who brought him to the woods and chose to walk with them 3/4 of a mile into the woods without hesitation. It was discovered that his wallet was still on him, money and credit cards left untouched. There was no reason to believe that this had been a crime of opportunity or a robbery gone bad. All signs pointed towards the person knowing David, David knowing them, and the killer meticulously planning his murder down to the very last detail.
While I agree with some of their theory, I don't know if I believe David walked into the woods willingly. Why would he? For what purpose? The ground was covered in snow, and he was wearing sneakers.
Exactly. Nobody wears sneakers to hike through 8 inches of snow. If he'd planned to enter those woods, he likely would have been wearing some type of boot. Also, it's reported that David was found wearing one of his Marine jackets, which he supposedly never wore in public. In a Boston 25 News article by Bob Ward, his attire was described as, quote, his U.S. Marines camouflage jacket over his black hooded U.S. Marines sniper jacket, end quote. There are so many things that stood out straight away, which may have led onlookers to believe this case would soon be closed. But as every lead investigators worked began to fizzle out, David's case grew colder and faded from the spotlight as time went by. Just a few years ago, in 2019, after 25 years had passed since David's murder, 2 detectives from the Massachusetts State Police would dive back into the investigation with fresh eyes. Their names are Detective John Fanning and Yuri Buchanek, and they're both retired U.S. Marines. Buchanek stated in an article with Fox News, quote, "It's one of those things. Never leave a brother behind. I feel like David has been left behind for 25 years, end quote.
I can't say that I don't agree. It seems like David's case got a fair amount of attention in the early days, only to be forgotten as time passed. It's sad to think that most of that attention, based on the headlines anyway, came from his connection to that movie.
Both detectives were interviewed by Bob Ward for Boston 25 News in 2019 about their renewed investigation into David's murder. It seems as though they've looked at multiple different scenarios, but a lot has been ruled out, at least in their minds. There have been several theories put forward in this case that should be discussed. The first revolving around some sketchy stuff that was going on at the United Parcel Service. So, as we know, David had been working there part-time before he was killed. Well, apparently, there was a situation going on where a supervisor and a driver for the company were involved in some less than legal activities. It's reported that these two employees may have been stealing packages, and David had somehow become aware of it. Stephen had mentioned this in the Unsolved Mysteries episode, stating that David's knowledge of the theft may have gotten him into trouble.
This makes me think right back to Sue Taraskowitz. Of course, the stuff going down at the airport seemed to be far more serious, but it's along the same lines. An employee becoming aware of criminal acts of their coworkers and potentially being targeted because of it.
I totally agree. But like you said, in this instance, what was said to be going on at UPS didn't seem like this big crazy thing. I'm not sure if these employees were even at risk of losing their jobs or going to jail for what they were doing if David had reported them.
I'm sure if David had outed them, they would have lost their jobs. They were stealing packages. I don't know if UPS is held to the same standard as USPS, but if they are, those would have been federal charges coming their way. But regardless of whether or not David had ratted on them, he seemed to be in good standing with the company, still being offered that full-time position.
I mean, federal charges are serious. No one wants to go to federal prison. So, do you think that'd be enough of a motive to want to kill him?
Depending on the person, anything is possible. But the real question is, if those UPS employees showed up at his house, would he have gone into the woods with them? My guess is no.
Very true. I think it'd have to be someone he was comfortable with and wouldn't think they'd be out to get him in any way. That is, if he really did go willingly. Another theory that's been brought forward stated that David enjoyed gambling, and perhaps he'd gotten himself into a sticky situation with the wrong kind of people. However, it's not stated anywhere that he'd racked up significant debts, certainly not any large enough to warrant a hit being placed on him. He allegedly had enough money in his bank account to cover the amount he owed, if it ever had to be taken care of. Some have also said that David's murder could have had something to do with his public distaste for the film A Few Good Men. As we know, David was less than thrilled with the movie and its adaptation of his real-life experiences. So, if there was this lawsuit filed and David was planning on getting involved in it, could someone from the production company have offed him?
No freaking way. If David ended up joining that lawsuit, the production company would have just had one more check to write. Big deal. They wouldn't have hired someone to hunt this guy down and kill him.
That's pretty much what I was thinking. I don't believe that movie companies are in the business of killing people who want to sue them, but I guess you can't totally rule it out. There was a lot of animosity going around. David was doing a ton of interviews and saying some stuff that could have pissed a lot of people off, and maybe someone wanted to harm him because of it. But you'd have to think that if the lawsuit was a motivation for someone to murder him, that some of the other guys who were planning on suing would have also been threatened, harmed, or killed. Why would they have specifically picked David?
They wouldn't have. They would have paid him and the other guys off in a settlement out of court and went on their merry way.
For sure. Most large companies have no problem shelling out millions to shut people up. The Hollywood bigwigs weren't the only people David had been criticizing in those interviews, though. On the Unsolved Mysteries website, there's a write-up that covers David's case. One of the passages within stated, quote, "After the release of A Few Good Men, David gave an interview on the radio. He was quite vocal about his story and the U.S. activities in Cuba. David's mother worried that he'd been too outspoken. After I heard that interview on the radio, I spoke to him and I said, 'I don't like what you're doing. I think what you're doing is dangerous.' I think he felt far too free to just speak his mind," end quote.
Well, reading between the lines on that one, it sure makes it seem like David's mother was worried about him prattling on about what had been going on in the military. If whatever he had been saying was bad enough to be deemed dangerous, there may be cause for concern.
And you're not the only person who would pick up on that. Stephen had mentioned previously that he believes his brother's murder may have been tied to the military. Stephen said in an interview with Bob Ward, quote, "It has military written all over it. It's too highly planned. My feeling is it was retribution," end quote. When Bob asked Stephen why he felt this way, his response was, quote, "What happened in the Corps? What happened in Gitmo," end quote. However, Christine feels otherwise. She stated that she believes it was pre-planned to look like the military was involved, that it wasn't carried out by anyone with that kind of connection. She told Bob Ward in that same interview, quote, To suggest this was military, I think, was trying to throw us off track, end quote.
I'd like to know what evidence she's seen that leads her to that opinion. I'm not jumping to any conclusions here, but if you're going to rule something out, you should probably have a solid basis to do so, or at least one based on logic. Like with the idea that the movie company would have gone after him. That's totally illogical, because they'd most likely just pay David off to solve the problem before getting wrapped up in a scandal that could destroy themselves.
Well, one of those detectives that I talked about earlier, Detective Buchanan, stated in that same interview, quote, "The military connection was investigated and vetted out," end quote. So maybe she was thinking that if the cops have ruled out that theory, then they most likely have done their due diligence and it's safe to side with their beliefs.
I guess, but we still don't know what evidence the detectives have gathered to come to that conclusion either. You know me, I'm forever the skeptic. Until something is proven to me or ruled out through evidence, I'm always going to have some doubt.
And that's why we're married, our shared distrust of the human race. But really though, let's think about why Stephen may have felt so strongly that his brother's murder had, quote, military written all over it. For starters, motive. For all we know, some of the stuff he was saying could have been information that shouldn't have been released to the public. Or maybe he said the wrong thing about the wrong person and they wanted him dead. He also called out his commanding officer during the court-martial and ended up as one of the few Marines to be found guilty of only simple assault and later receive an honorable discharge. Could this have angered the other members of the 10 who were handed down heavier sentences and dishonorable discharges? Or maybe he antagonized powerful individuals by the sole fact of going to trial in the first place.
I think all of these could be reasons for a certain type of person to seek retribution. But if I had to pick the worst violation from the military's perspective, it'd have to have been those interviews. Going public with information and maybe even secrets that had occurred at Gitmo was a bad decision.
I tried to find some of the old interviews David had taken part in, but it seems like even the archives of the publications they were in are hard to come by. But it makes me wonder how much he may have divulged that maybe he shouldn't have. And then you have to think, David was a skilled Marine. Based on photographs, he appeared to stay in shape and looked capable of handling himself. So you have to assume that whoever killed him most likely had a similar skill set to his.
Not to mention the ability to plan a murder and get away with it for over 25 years now.
Exactly. It certainly wasn't some random Joe Schmo off the street. Honestly, if you had to bet on who would be more capable of something like this, between a trained killer and a package delivery person, who would you choose?
I don't think that even requires an answer.
You're right, it doesn't. Now, I'm not saying that Marines are the only type of people capable of this murder. Far from it. This entire theory could be way off base, and someone could have hired a professional for the job. But the more you look into the evidence, the more it makes you think. The fact that David was wearing his Marine Corps jacket at the time he was murdered stood out to investigators and those close to him. His family and friends have said they were sure he wouldn't have worn that jacket unless he knew the person he was going out with, and they were aware of his service. And something else I found online intrigued me about this whole jacket situation. On the Unsolved Mysteries page where they had a rundown of the episode covering David, there's a comment section. One person there mentioned that David may have worn this jacket on purpose to identify who took him out of the house that day, which led me to wonder what could have taken place if this were true. So let's go back to the morning of January 5th. David likely got up sometime after Elaine left for work. Based on the message left by UPS, we can infer that something must have happened to him between 8:30 and 11:30 a.m. What if he went out to start his car and warm it up since it was cold and had just snowed the night before? He could have been getting ready to head out and cash that check that was left on the dashboard. So after he started the car, he went back inside to grab whatever else he needed, with his killer or killers following in closely behind him. They could have held him at gunpoint while they searched the house for any witnesses, and then ordered him outside to their vehicle. With his 9mm left in the glove box of his truck, perhaps he felt he had no other choice but to comply. Then, before they leave, David could have grabbed that distinct jacket to throw over what he was wearing as a sort of clue. He could have been leaving breadcrumbs behind to help investigators find the ones responsible for his murder.
I think what holds this whole theory together is that last bit, the jacket. If it was so unusual for David to be wearing it at the time that it stuck out to both investigators and his family, it's gotta mean something. And I heard you slip killer or killers in there. The idea that there could have been more than one assailant makes it more believable as to why David would have followed their commands.
Exactly. Because think about it. If it was one-on-one, don't you think he would have fought back?
I think you have to assume so.
To me, this makes way more sense than the seemingly outlandish notion that's been put forward, where someone that David knew convinced him to walk 3/4 of a mile through snow into the middle of the woods. I just can't get on board with that idea. I mean, seriously, if someone I knew was like, oh yeah, let's go for a hike through the woods after a snowstorm in the middle of January, first off, I'd tell them they're nuts. But even if I did agree, I'd put some damn boots on. And if they were like, oh no, you're good, let's just go, I'm gonna laugh in their face while questioning what the hell they're up to. There's literally no reason I can imagine as to why David would be like, yep, let's just go for a casual 30-minute stroll in 8 inches of snow and 25-degree weather in the middle of the friggin' woods.
Which solidifies the idea that one or more people forced him out there. I can see that. And I'm with you on the whole stroll through the woods thing. You'd have to give me a damn good reason to go out there. And let's not forget, David slept on the couch because his back was bothering him. I'm sure he wasn't chomping at the bit to go on an unexpected hike first thing in the morning. Not to mention he was waiting for that phone call from UPS.
I totally forgot about his back. That's just another reason not to believe he left his house with someone willingly. So then, back to his potential killers. If there were indeed 2 of them, and let's say they each had a firearm, David probably would have been less likely to fight back. Maybe he thought he could have made an escape on his way to wherever they were going. But it's also possible that David may have known that this was the end, that something he said regarding the military had set these people on a warpath, and there was no changing their mind on what they were going to do to him. So he went along with them. He walked through the woods, and his life was ended in the blink of an eye. One last thing that helps bring this whole theory together is that when David went out with his brother the night before he went missing, he was acting weird and gave what seems to be a generic response of girlfriend troubles. But maybe he knew something bad was going to happen, that whoever he pissed off was coming after him. And because of that, even though he was hesitant to go out at first, he took this opportunity to grab drinks with Steven, knowing that those may have been the last moment they'd ever spend together.
With that in mind, if David truly knew that there was no getting out of the situation he was in, regardless of if it had to do with the military, the movie company, or UPS, you've got to remember that quote from earlier when he was talking to his lawyer. I have nothing else. I want to be a Marine. This guy was a Marine through and through, and if he knew he was going to die, he would have wanted to die as one. And maybe that's why he wore the jacket that day. Not as a clue or a breadcrumb, but as a symbol of the man he was.
It's been over 25 years since David was murdered, and to this day, no one has ever been named as a suspect, and it doesn't seem like there are many leads being worked. Authorities appear to have ruled out every possible theory that has come across their desks. But I think there's more to the story, more that authorities aren't ready or willing to release publicly. The detectives working the case have put out one request, though, that if there are any witnesses who were in the area of David's apartment on January 5th, 1994, that may have seen him leave the house between 8:30 a.m. and noon, to please come forward. At the end of the day, no matter the reason, it's unjust that David's life was cut short, that he lost out on valuable time with his loved ones, who've been left with so many unanswered questions and frustrations for all these years. The Cox family deserves to know who killed their beloved soldier, and they should be able to look in the eyes of those responsible as they face judgment. David's sister Christine told Boston 25 News, quote, "David's life mattered. He was erased. This person erased his life, his future. I want the killer identified. Not to us, to the world. I want everybody to know who did it. I want him to pay for it." If you have any information about who killed David Cox, please contact the Norfolk County District Attorney's Office at 617-593-8840. Thank you all so much for tuning in every week. We're so happy to have you here. Make sure to leave us a 5-star review before you go and follow us on our socials.
You can follow us on Instagram at wicked.deeds.podcast and on Twitter at wickeddeeds. Don't forget to visit our website, wickeddeedspodcast.com, to take a look at any photos from this episode and view our source material.
But most importantly, tune in next week for an all-new episode.